Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to get right to it. The past couple of days I've been having some serious technical issues running the trains. They are running very erratically and some of them not even running at all. It took me a long time and a lot of research to figure this out. There's not a lot of information out there regarding this issue. So apparently a tree fell down a couple of days ago and took out the power lines in the street. When the power company restored the power, my trains all of a sudden were out of sync. They weren't running right at all, and I couldn't figure it out. At first I thought it was an electrical problem. So I tested the track, I tested the trains, I tested the transformers. Everything seemed to work fine. The conventional trains were running just fine using the transformer throttles. The legacy trains were running fine in conventional mode, but they weren't running at all in legacy mode. So finally I was able to isolate that it's not an electrical issue, but a command signal issue coming from the legacy command base. Somehow the locomotives weren't receiving the signal or not receiving it properly. Therefore, they would either run very erratically, stop and go, or just stop and go into conventional mode. Stop running in legacy mode completely. Some of the trains just stop and shut off. So I couldn't figure this out. So I did a lot of research, and what I was able to find out was this is an earth-ground issue. So what's happening is this. Now pay attention, if you're building a layout or you're just about to complete it, or you already have an existing layout like I do that's finished, guess what guys? We have to go back and install an earth ground. Now I'm going to explain it in detail, or at least as best as I can, right now. Okay, so it works like this. In the United States, we have 60 Hertz AC power. When the power is being transmitted, this represents 0 right here. This is the power that's being transmitted. Alternating current goes from negative DC to positive DC back to negative. So it's alternating right here. Every time it alternates and it passes the 0 mark, it does it at 60 times a second. Every time it passes 0, 60 times a second. Transfers from negative to positive DC and back to negative again, right here. So in the United States, this happens 60 times a second. In Europe, it happens 50 times a second. When my legacy command base is connected to the layout, it's matching this electrical signal, this electrical current. Every time it passes here at the 0 mark, it's called a sync pulse. So the Lionel legacy command base also matches that sync pulse to send out a burst of signal 60 times a second also. So a command signal is being transmitted by the Lionel legacy command base 60 times a second. And that signal is being broadcast through the tracks, through the outside rail of the tracks, to your locomotive, 60 times a second. Now that's very important here, and I'm going to explain it further. Okay, inside the locomotive, the receiver is connected to the chassis, which is the ground, and the other side is connected to the pickup rollers that roll along the center rail and pick up the electrical power. So the receiver is looking for that sync pulse that's being transmitted through the outside rails of your layout. Because the transformer and command base are getting power from the electricity coming out of your electrical socket in your house, the antenna in the locomotive is receiving that sync pulse signal 60 times a second. This is how the locomotive communicates with the radio signal being broadcast through the outside rails of your track on the layout. And it works like this. Here's the locomotive. Here's your track, your 3-rail track. Here's your center rail, and here's your both outside rails. The legacy command signal is being broadcast from the outside rails. This is the radio signal. Now it's being broadcast out of both outside rails. Lionel Fast Track, the outside rails are connected together. On all the other ones, such as Guard Graves and Atlas O and various other tracks, they are not connected together. So it's important, if you're using any other 3-rail track, other than Lionel Fast Track to make sure that your outside rails are connected together. Therefore, they can broadcast that command signal out of both outside rails. The receiver in the locomotive is picking up this radio signal that's being broadcast out of both outside rails and picking up that legacy signal. That is how you're controlling your locomotive. So both outside rails are broadcasting that command signal. So this is the crosshatch. That command signal is crossing each other here above that particular track. So the transformer is sending out a wave signal to our receiver in the locomotive to expect a command signal at each sync pulse interval 60 times a second. The base is broadcasting the signal that aligns itself with the locomotive antenna. So the transformer is connected to the center rail, AC hot, and connected to the outside rail with AC ground. The legacy command base is connected to this ground here, which allows it to broadcast the signal, again, through the outside rails, picked up from the receiver in the locomotive. So what happens is the train will stop or just go into conventional mode, or the lights will flicker, or all of the above, or any combination of the above. That means the locomotive is waiting for a command signal to be sent out and picked up by the antenna. The reason this occurs is that the command signals are overlapping one another. So it's never an issue of not enough signal. It's an issue of too much signal. Too much signal is being picked up by the receiver antenna in the locomotive. It is not an issue of not enough signal, no matter how big your layout is. So track 1, that sync pulse is being broadcast at 60 times a second. On track 2, it's also being broadcast 60 times a second. And normally, it would be in sync with track 1. But in this case, track 2 command signal is just a little off. It is not in sync with the signal being sent out of track 1. So what's happening is the locomotive now is not picking it up 60 times a second. It is picking it up now 120 times a second. And that's what's causing the lights to flicker. It's picking up too much signal because the sync pulse in track 1 is not in sync with the sync pulse in track 2. So they're both broadcasting at 60 times a second, but at different intervals. And it could be a millisecond off. But it's now 120 times a second the signal is being received through your locomotive antenna, the receiver in the locomotive antenna. 120 times a second if there's 2-track. So it looks like this. Here's 3 separate tracks. The first track is 100 feet long, the second track is 100 feet long, and the third track is 75 feet long. The lengths don't really matter, but what's happening is through all 3 tracks, that command signal is being broadcast by each outside rail of each track loop at 60 pulses per second. That command signal is being sent out of the outside rails of each track loop, 60 pulses per second per track. But there's crosstalk now in between because it's no longer in sync with each other. So it's coming out at 60 pulses per second of the outside rail here and 60 pulses per second of the outside rail here. So when the locomotive is coming down the track, it could be picking up 120 pulses per second, which causes it to be confused. It's too much signal being received through the antenna, the receiver antenna of the locomotive. Here it could be 60, 120, or 180. So you have 60 here, 60 or 120 being picked up here, 60, 120, or 180 being picked up here when the locomotive is running on either side of this track, and then 60 pulses per second back here. There's too much signal being broadcast out of each outside rail, only because they're not in sync with each other. Normally they're supposed to be in sync with each other, so it'll always be 60 pulses per second. But if they're a millisecond off between the tracks, now there's too much signal being broadcast. 60 coming out of here, 60 coming out of here, and 60 coming out of here, which can total 60, 120, or 180. And it should only be 60 for normal legacy operation. So how do we solve this? We solve it with what's called a ground plane. Now, I've got this information from Lionel. Again, it wasn't easy to find. You have to pull the bits and pieces together. And what a ground plane essentially is a wire that's connected to the ground terminal of your electrical outlet. And it has to have insulation around it. And you lay that wire in between the track. That's all you have to do, is just connect it to here's your outlet, connect it to that ground. You have to ground that wire and then just lay it in between the track. It is not connected to the track, it's just laid in between the track. And what that does is it blocks that signal from track 1 from going over to track 2. So you will always have 60 pulses per second over track 1, 60 pulses per second over track 2. And then you just lay another wire in between every track. Again, it's not connected to your track. It is just an electrical wire that's insulated. It is not connected to anything on the other end. It just terminates. But it has to be connected to the ground of your electrical outlet. And basically it acts like a shield or a force field. It does not allow the command signal to penetrate it. So it's keeping 60 pulses per second on each track. And this will restore signal operation to your locomotives, and they will run normally again. So here's the outlet coming out of the wall in your house. You're going to connect that wire here. Well, that's earth ground. So that's where you will connect it and just run it in between your tracks on your layout. I've made 3 track here. When you lay that wire in between the tracks, when that signal is being broadcast out of the outside rails, it's essentially a force field or a shield. It blocks that signal from going over to the other side. So now the locomotive that's coming down on any one of the tracks will only receive the 60 pulse per second sync pulse, and it will run a normal operation. That earth ground wire that's just laid in between the tracks will block the signal from being transmitted over to the other track. And that's the solution here. So what you have to do again is connect it to earth ground. That's the 3rd prong in your electrical outlet. It could be any size wire. It could be solid or stranded. It doesn't matter. The diameter of the size doesn't matter either. It could be a very thick wire, very thin wire. Again, it doesn't matter. It just, what matters is it needs to be insulated and it needs to be connected to earth ground, with the other end not connected to anything. It's just ending on your layout. Lay it in between your track, right on the table, cover it with your ballast, and that's fine, because now you have an earth ground in between the tracks. That command signal, again, if it's ever not in sync, it will be blocked from being transmitted to the other tracks, which is what happened in my case. This is my 3rd layout using a Lionel legacy command system. So I've used it for at least 10 years so far. I have never ever had any issues. I've run multiple trains, multiple tracks, multiple levels, and I've never had an issue in 10 years and 3 layouts. But this week, all of a sudden, everything was out of whack for whatever reason. And what Lionel explains is the dynamics, each layout is different. It can work like mine did now. This particular layout has been working for the past 1.5 years. No issues whatsoever with the command signal. But ever since I lost power and the power was restored, somehow it's a millisecond off now between the electric pulse coming out of the wall in the transformer and the command signal coming out of the command base. They're supposed to match each other and be in line at both at 60 pulses per second. Now it's become they're a millisecond off, so each track is broadcasting at different intervals. So now in between the tracks, it could be 60 pulses per second, 120, 180, 240, and so forth. So the locomotive is being confused. Again, it's an issue of too much signal. There's crosstalk with the signal. It's not an issue of not enough signal. And it took me forever to figure this out. So one easy solution and an easy test is to put your hand, is turn the power on to the locomotive. You'll see the lights flickering. Put your hand near it. Your body's creating a ground. When you put your hand near the locomotive, that light should stay solid. And that's what's happening in my case. So I was able to prove with that method that I have an earth ground issue. Watch this, guys. Now, I don't know if you can see, I hope you can see, the lights are flickering right here on that locomotive. But when I put my hand near it, that light is now solid. I'm creating a ground between myself and that locomotive antenna, the receiver antenna. Again, I back away, the light starts to flicker. I go close to it, the light stays solid. I'm creating that ground for that receiver to pick up the sync pulse signal coming out of the outside rails. And that would solve the problem. But I can't stay here all day, keeping my hand above the trains. So you have to lay the wire in between each track section. Now, unfortunately, I have to climb on top of the layout to do this. I wish I knew this information before. Again, it wasn't easy to find. It took me a long time and a lot of research to figure this all out. But nevertheless, I'll make a separate video of the wire earth ground installation on a finished layout such as this, on how we could do it without doing any damage or taking anything apart. It can be done. I do have to climb on top of the layout. And again, I'll make a separate video for that. Another quick test, right? First, you're putting your hand close to the locomotive, and you'll see the light stop flickering. That tells you have a command issue. That's an earth ground issue. Another test is just to take an extension cord, plug it into the outlet, run it underneath your layout. It could just lay on the floor underneath your layout, and then try to run your trains. In my case, that solved it also, because now I have earth ground. The extension cord is plugged into earth ground. That third prong is plugged into the outlet. I ran the extension cord throughout the length of the layout, underneath the layout, and then the trans ran fine. Everything ran fine. Apparently, another issue is with the tunnels. There seems to be some kind of a command signal issue. Not everybody has this. Not every layout has this. Mine didn't have it for 2 years. All of a sudden this week it did. So it can happen at any time. It depends on the dynamics of the layout. If those dynamics have changed or may change or may never change, your layout can be run perfectly. But if you're building a layout now or about to build a layout, or if you can go back and lay that earth ground wire, then do it. Because unfortunately, if you're like me and it happens when you're all finished, it's a little bit of a problem. So what happens, especially at tunnels, let's say you have a tunnel here with a track that runs on top of it. And here's your track going into the tunnel. This track is emitting a sync pulse 60 times a second. And then so is this track up here that's running over the top of it. So the train that's going into the tunnel could be receiving crosstalk signal at 120 pulses per second, and it will stop in the tunnel. So if you have a situation where your locomotive is erratic or not running properly through the tunnel, it could be crosstalk between the tracks. And what Lionel is recommending to do is when you're building your track above the tunnel here, when you're laying this track up here, just run a piece of wire in a zigzag fashion like this. So when you run your track on top of that wire, that earth ground wire, that earth is connected that wire is connected to your outlet, to your ground here. That has to be connected. When that wire is running a zigzag pattern and the track is laid over it, it is shielding that signal from going into the tunnel. So the locomotive going to the tunnel here will only pick up 60 pulses per second of sync pulse coming out of the track in the tunnel. It will not receive that signal coming over the track on top of the tunnel. In a case like I have here, where the track above is broadcasting a command signal 60 times a second, and the track below, when the train goes through, it can get confused if that signal is off by even a millisecond. In this case, I don't have that issue. It's running fine. But Lionel did explain that is a potential issue when you have one track on top of another. So they recommend is running a wire underneath that track in a zigzag pattern connected to earth ground. And that will help shield and block the signal being broadcast top to bottom and bottom to top from the track. It's very important that to make sure that that wire is properly connected to the earth ground on your electrical outlet, right to the ground. Again, the other end doesn't need to be connected to anything. Do not connect it to the track. Just lay it in between the track or under the track. If you have an overpass or a tunnel situation where you have one track on top of the other, lay it in a zigzag pattern underneath that track, and it will help protect and keep only 60 pulses per second of sync pulse command signal being transmitted to the receiver antenna in the locomotive. And then your locomotive will run perfectly. It will run nice and smooth. So if you're experiencing erratic behavior or lights flickering like I have right now, which I never had before, so this just happened, guys. I have so many videos posted on my channel, I've never had any issue. And all of a sudden, I can't run trains. So something happened, that sync pulse is off for whatever reason. It is no longer matching each other from one track to the next. I've already run an extension cord that's plugged into the outlet underneath my layout. That solved my problem. But I'm going to run a more permanent system, which is an electrical wire that's insulated. It could be stranded, it could be solid, it could be any size diameter wire. It doesn't matter. As long as you run it in between the tracks, you can cover it with the ballast. At each loop, it will isolate the command signal from being broadcast from one set of tracks to the other set of tracks. Well, everybody, I hope this video helps you. Thank you very much for watching. My name is George. Until next time, bye for now.